Delighted that you're here. Our number may be down just a little bit, perhaps because of weather, sickness, and various other sundry things. But I am delighted that you are here. In light of our studies in Genesis that we're in the middle of, or at least we got started here recently in Genesis, and we're studying on the flood. On Wednesday nights, we looked at the first part of that story, and we're going to pick up and continue the story of the flood in our study tonight, Wednesday night. But in view of that, I want to raise a question that is often raised in connection with that, and that is, what about man and dinosaurs? Did they coexist? Are they real? Etc. I want to suggest to you that the dinosaur is the poster child of evolution. How so? Well, we've been inundated with all kinds of information, whether it be in the television or in books or in classrooms or museums or movies or magazines. This information says that dinosaurs lived millions and millions of years ago. And so if you open up your internet and begin just to search a little bit about dinosaurs, you'll find some information that says they lived millions and millions of years ago. We're told that dinosaurs and man were separated by 60 plus million years. They could not and did not coexist, we are told. The term dinosaur is not an ancient term. You would think if dinosaurs are millions and millions and millions of years old and man didn't come around till 60 million years after that, that this would be a common term all through the centuries and centuries and centuries or millions of years back, perhaps. But it's not an ancient term. I don't want to take a lot of time going through this information. Just want to give you the idea that in 1822, there was this English doctor, Mantell, who lived near Oxford, England. His wife, Mary, who collected fossils, tagged along on a visit one day. And on a walk, she found this huge fossilized tooth that had to be cut out of rock. Her husband looked at it and found more teeth and more bones in the area. And then he sent that off to a French fossil expert who mistakenly identified this tooth, this fossil, as perhaps from an ancient rhinoceros or hippopotamus. And so it later identified differently than that. But at first, that's how it was identified. Dr. Mantell showed the tooth to one of those who were familiar with the iguana, and he thought this tooth maybe was much larger than that, and so they realized they had found some kind of new animal. So they gave it the name iguanodon, meaning iguana tooth. Well, as time went on, the same fossils or similar fossils were found. They were given the name Megalosaurus, meaning giant lizard. Well, Dr. Richard Owen, one of England's greatest anatomical researchers, studied the bones that had been discovered in both cases, and he concluded this is the bones of some kind of animal that's not living at the present. And so they gave it a new order and a new name, dinosaur, which meant terrible lizard. It comes from the Greek dino, terrible, and sauros, meaning lizard, and he translated that saying that this term simply means fearfully great lizards. And that didn't come around to about 1840. So that raises now some questions about dinosaurs. Were they real? Did they exist? Does the Bible talk about them? And when did they exist? And did man and dinosaurs live at the same time? Did they ever coexist? And if they did exist, what happened to all the dinosaurs? Why don't we have them around now? And so what does the Bible say? Or does the Bible say anything? Or does the Bible put itself in contradiction to any kind of concept that there were dinosaurs that lived on earth? So let's look at several things tonight. This may help us when we get into our study of the flood. So that's why I am putting this material right here at this time, is so that we can connect this with our study of the flood on Wednesday nights. So what is at issue with reference to the question of dinosaurs? The average child's view of dinosaurs is that they lived millions and millions of years ago. Brad Harrop and Bert Thompson, who are members of the Church of Christ, though institutional, made the point that some time ago at a camp for Christian young people, a short 3-question survey was given to the teenagers in attendance, most of whom come from homes with Christian parents, and many of whom had already made a decision to become a Christian themselves. The first question was, how long ago did dinosaurs live? And provided 4 possible answers. Over 70%. Now get that figure in your mind. Over 70% of these so-called Christian children said that they walked on earth millions of years ago. Now these are not children raised in the homes of atheists, not those who are avowed evolutionists. These were supposed to be children from homes of those who were God-fearing creationists. They said they existed millions of years ago. So the dinosaur has become the tool for teaching evolution. So from kindergarten through graduate school, it's used to indoctrinate students about evolution being a fact, as if evolution is assumed to be a fact. It is discussed in the context of evolution, the origin and the development and the extension, I can't get the word out, extension of the dinosaurs is discussed in the context of evolution. Right in the context of evolution is where we discuss them becoming extinct. Now, it is given, and by given we simply are saying that it is assumed. Much of evolution is based on assumption. We've talked about that recently. Much of their argument is based on assumption of what we know. Here's what we understand millions of years ago. So it is given that they existed millions of years ago. They had to be millions of years ago, we assume, or they assume. So we're told that the ancient reptile evolved into a dinosaur and then it evolved into birds. So what happened? Well, there was this ancient reptile that it evolved over periods of time till we had the dinosaur, and then millions of years later it finally developed into birds. And that's what really happened to them, though they have some other ideas that we'll talk about in a moment. So when I'm talking about it being a tool, it starts with a fascination with dinosaurs as the child is fascinated and they read a little bit about or read to them about dinosaurs, and they are told millions of years ago. Then they march off to school to learn about evolution. Now, here's a toy, and I have no problem with having toy dinosaurs around. I think they're good teaching tools to teach the truth. They're all over my upstairs. I have grandchildren. There's dinosaurs all over our upstairs. All right, it's a good teaching tool. But it's also a teaching tool for the evolutionist. The child becomes fascinated with dinosaurs, and that then becomes such an effective teaching aid. And because they're generally used to teach evolution, it is an effective teaching tool. And so it becomes the formidable tool for robbing students of their faith of all ages. And that makes the controversy over dinosaurs the most important for us to tackle and for us to deal with. Now, let's talk about how effective the tool is. I won't read every word of these quotations, but here's some evolutionists like Stephen Jay Gould and the famed dinosaur hunter and Robert Baker. They were on record as stating that the study of dinosaurs at a very young age is what set them on a long path as evolutionists. They started with some assumptions. They were fascinated with dinosaurs, and they make some assumptions, or others made assumptions for them. They buy into that and made them lifelong evolutionists. What I'm suggesting is it's a very effective tool. Others have said the same thing, that they set out maybe as believers at first. They believed in some fundamental religion, and then they became fascinated with evolution, perhaps through the looking at dinosaurs. Henry Morris, who was a creationist, a former professor and department of the head at Virginia Polytechnic Institute, observed that over 28 years of teaching in secular institutions, he saw this tale repeated time and time and time again, where the dinosaur is used as a tool for instilling in the idea of evolution in the hearts of young people. The question, we're still talking about what is at issue. The question is, when did they exist? The evolutionist will assume, and they tell us, that they evolved some 200 million years ago. They became extinct some 65 to 70 million years ago. Now, you may read after an evolutionist who has that just a little bit different. They're not real sure. So, there's a lot of difference between 65 and 70 million. There's 5 million years right there. That's a long time, 5 million years. But they say then man evolved some 2 to 3 million years ago. So man came much later, millions of years later than these dinosaurs, because they cannot coexist. More about that in a little bit. Here's some statements from some evolutionists who say, here's one that said about 65 million years ago, something killed half of all the life on the earth. This sensational crime wiped out the dinosaurs. And again, here's another one that says 65 million years ago. 65 million years ago is when they existed and they were wiped out on the face of the earth. This is National Geographic, which is well known for their advocacy of evolution. This is in January of 1993. There is a statement made, no human being ever has seen a live dinosaur. No human being ever laid eyes on a dinosaur. They were millions of years before man ever developed. Now, let's put beside that the creationist timetable with reference to that. That is, the evolutionists say they evolved some 200 million years ago. We've already gone over all of that. So what about the creationists? Well, they think Genesis, and that's what we are, that Genesis account is a literal account of the 6 days of creation. That the dinosaurs were created within the 6 literal days. And that man was created on the 6 days, meaning man and dinosaurs lived together. We'll give more evidence of that a little bit later. So the creationist model concerning dinosaurs differs greatly from the evolutionist model of the dinosaur. They both agree that they existed. They both agree they existed a long time ago, though the evolutionists have to have them millions and millions of years long before man ever came into existence. So how do dinosaurs prove evolution? How is it that the evolutionists think, let's talk about dinosaurs because that's really going to help us advance the cause of evolution? How do they do that? And how does that work for them? Well, here's the common thought, that dinosaurs were enormous killing machines. They were enormous in size, and man and dinosaurs could not live together. Here is the assumptions again. They were enormous killing machines. That's a big assumption, number one. Number two, they couldn't exist together because of that, and so they had to be millions of years apart. We separate them by at least 65 to 70 million years because of those assumptions. So now we know what's at issue with the question of the dinosaurs. They have to be millions of years ago. They cannot coexist with man. They cannot be mentioned in the Bible and the Bible be true. So that's why the question of the dinosaur is important to the creationist. Now, let's raise this question. Were they real and did they exist? Now listen to this carefully as I suggest. We make a big mistake, and there are some creationists who think they're doing their children a favor to tell their child that dinosaurs are just imagined. They're not real. They didn't exist. These toys that we have, we just play with them, but there is no such thing as real dinosaurs. There never was any real dinosaurs. Because when your child then comes into evidence that there were dinosaurs on earth, that's going to destroy their faith in you as well as the Word of God. Because you've just told them the Word of God doesn't agree with the concept of dinosaurs. That's a huge mistake to make. Let's talk about some of the physical evidence that dinosaurs were real and they existed. Let's talk about what has been discovered and where they have been discovered. This again is from Brad Harrop and Bert Thompson of Apologetics Press. If you're not familiar with that and you have young children and you're going to be battling those questions, you might take a look at Apologetics Press. I believe that's .org instead of .com. There's a world of wealth of information there. They said we have discovered their fossilized remains in all 7 continents from North America to Antarctica and to the Antarctic. As a matter of fact, great dinosaur graveyards have been discovered in Tanzania, Africa, and the Dinosaur National Monument in Colorado-Utah border in the United States. Literally tons of fossilized dinosaur bones have been recovered from all over the globe. In 1993, Mike Hammer even unearthed a fossilized dinosaur from the Hell Creek Formation in the northwestern South Dakota that was said to still possess the ancient creature's heart. Plus, of course, paleontologists have unearthed numerous caches of fossilized dinosaur eggs. Is there abundant evidence? These are creationists who are saying we have found, and there have been found, a number of things. Here's another work that you might want to take a look at. If you want to teach your children the truth about dinosaurs, Dwayne Gish, who is a creationist, he's not a New Testament Christian, but he is a creationist, said fossils of dinosaurs have been discovered in just about every place in the world, from Alaska to Siberia to Antarctica, etc. And many have been found in Canada and U.S., especially in the western states, Colorado, Utah, Montana, Wyoming, and on down the line with other countries. And so there have been fossils of dinosaurs found all over the world, and particularly in the western part of the United States. Now here's some samplings of the findings. I won't go through every detail of these. Here's one that Gish presents in his work. I have that work with me if you want to take a look at his work. That here is one that has been found in Mongolia, 1922. The bones were found in the nest of large eggs. The crushed skull may suggest the mother caught him stealing eggs. Here is another dinosaur remains that were found that the name simply means wounding tooth. In 1980, there were teeth and nest and eggs that were young and full-size skeletons were found. So there were some small skeletons, big skeletons were found. That was found in Montana. Here is another Triceratops, the three-horned face is what that means. The full skeleton was found in 1888 in Wyoming. The skull was about 7 feet long. And so there have been one after the other that was, here's another one in the 1980s, was found that there was a large herd that was found in Canada. The name simply means the well-horned lizard. Well, here's another one that was found in 1940. Excavations in Utah found bones of some 40 to 60 dinosaurs buried together. And on down the line, here is one of the more noted ones. In 1877, there was the hip and a back fossil found in Morrison, Colorado. And so thus given the name of Apatosaurus. In 1879, March found almost a complete skeleton in Wyoming. In 1975, there was more remains that were found. In Texas, some 23 footsteps were found. Footprints were found, and each footstep measured 39 inches long. What we're suggesting is, whether it be in the western part of the United States, be it in Canada, or be it in South America, around the world, there's been abundant evidence found that indeed they really did exist. So let's turn now in our Bibles. We haven't gone there yet. We've been dealing with some evidence. And I quickly ran through that because you're not going to remember each one of those. But you say, I want to study about that more. We can supply you with evidence where you can read more about the dinosaurs in Gish's book or on Apologetics Press or any of the other places. Is there any biblical evidence about dinosaurs? Well, let's see. God created all animals. And we're going now, not on an assumption, but based on the evidence we've already seen, dinosaurs were real, and there have been remains that have been found that suggest dinosaurs did exist. We'll talk about the timing of that a little bit later. But they did exist, and they were real. So if they were, then when God created all animals, he had to create them. In Genesis 1:21, God created every living thing. We saw that in Genesis 1 in our opening text. All right? Here's another reference. Genesis 1:31 said, God saw that everything was good, meaning it's complete. It's not that God created all animals, and then somehow later they're developed and evolved into these dinosaurs millions of years later. It was all complete. In fact, Psalm 33, which is not on the screen, God spoke and it was done, and it stood fast. All things that were created were done instantaneously. Genesis 2:1, heaven and earth and all the host in them were finished. So God has created all things. If he created all animals, then that had to include the dinosaur during that 6 days. Exodus 20 and verse 11, in 6 days, God created all the heavens and earth and the sea. All that's in the heavens and the earth and the sea. So if dinosaurs were in the earth or in the sea, a sea creature, then God had to create it in those 6 days, according to Exodus chapter 20. Well, here's another reference. In John 1 and in verse 3, all things were made through him. If dinosaurs did exist, then God had to create them. Now, dinosaurs are not mentioned in the Bible, it might be argued. And so some assume they didn't exist. We read our Bibles, and I don't remember reading about dinosaurs. I don't remember the word dinosaur. Don't remember a thing about that in the Bible. So we assume, and so we're doing what the evolutionists do, we assume they didn't exist, where they assume concerning their age. Well, that word didn't come around to 1840. The Bible was in existence long before that. There's a number of things we know exist that are not mentioned in the Bible. Do you know the Bible doesn't mention cats, kangaroos, penguins, elephants, or bacteria? And no one will deny any of that. Well, elephants are not real and they don't exist because they're not mentioned in the Bible. Bacteria is not mentioned there. And so the same thing with kangaroos and cats and so on down the line. Now, there are large dinosaur-like creatures that are mentioned in the Bible. Were these dinosaurs like we pictured a moment ago? I don't know. But I do know there's some large dinosaur-like creatures. We're not going to read all the details, but you may have some things noted in your text. I'll put the text before you, but you may have some things from previous studies, so you might want to turn to Job 40 and start there. We'll look at 2 or 3 passages where there is a large creature that is mentioned that God brings to the mind of Job. Now, God overwhelms Job in Job 40 concerning his greatness. That is not Job's greatness, but God's greatness. And one of the things he's trying to impress Job with is, look at the creatures that I have made and I have created, and do you know and understand about all of these? And so God's overwhelming him. So he mentions Behemoth or Behemoth. Both are severance pronunciation of that. Anyway, however you want to pronounce that, that is this creature, Behemoth, that is mentioned here. So let's see what's said about this creature beginning at verse 15. He says that his strength is in his hips. I'm reading at verse 16. And his power is in his stomach muscles. That he moves his tail like a cedar. And notice at verse 18, his bones are like beams of bronze, and his ribs like bars of iron. That sounds like some large, humongous creature that is very powerful. Sounds like a dinosaur-type creature. Do we know exactly what this creature was? No. No scholar knows for sure. And so you read one and he says, well, I think this is an elephant. Another one thinks it's a hippopotamus. Another one thinks it's a dinosaur. And others think it's something else. So we don't know exactly what that is. What I'm trying to suggest is here is some large dinosaur-like creature that is mentioned in the context. Let's go to the next chapter, chapter 41 now. There's Leviathan. Now, what is Leviathan? Well, we're not sure exactly. Some think it has to do with a whale. Some think it has to do with a dragon. Some think it has to do with something like a large crocodile. But whatever he was, mentioned in chapter 41 in verse 1, let's go a little bit further in our context. And notice that, notice verse 8. Verse 8 of our context. Lay your hand on him, remember the battle, never do it again. That sounds like this is a creature you mess with, and you don't want to mess with him again. This is a large, again, dinosaur-like creature, whatever it may have been, that seems to have great strength. We see this again at verse 18, a little bit later in the context, verse 19. Notice in verse 19 now that out of his mouth go burning lights, sparks of fire shoot out, smoke goes out of his nostrils, boiling pot and burning rushes. Again, here is some creature we don't know anything about or doesn't exist now that is mentioned here in this context. Let's go again to Job chapter 7 and in verse 12. Job said, am I a sea or a sea serpent? Now, your translation may not use the word sea serpent, but it may use something very similar to that you set guard over me. What is this sea serpent? Well, Brown, Driver, and Briggs, the Hebrew lexicon, says that could have reference to a dragon, it could have reference to a serpent or a sea monster, and some of their definitions involve a dragon or a dinosaur, a river monster, or a venomous snake. So which was it? I don't know. I don't know what it was. That same word is translated whales. It could have reference to a whale. It could have reference to dragons or sea monsters or a serpent. Again, some large creature is all we're trying to describe that did exist in the eyes and in the minds of biblical writers. Now, the Bible repeatedly talks about dragons. Now, you have a translation that may mention another word, and most likely you do, unless you're using the King James Version. And here are a number of passages. I'm not going to take the time to read them, but if you take your King James and trace all of those references, you're going to see a reference to a dragon, a dragon, a dragon, and a dragon. Is it the same thing in every one of those texts? Is it referring to the same creature? And I think the answer would be absolutely not. All I want you to see is that there are dragon legends and traditions around the world. Henry Morris, a creationist. Do I recommend his book? You may not agree with everything, nor would I, but he has done us a great service on his work on the Genesis flood. He said the frequent reference to dragons in the Bible, as well as in the early records and traditions of most nations of antiquity, certainly cannot be shrugged off as merely fairy tales. That's interesting. Most probably they represent memories of dinosaurs handed down by the tribal ancestors who encountered them before they became extinct. That's interesting. Here's these traditions handed down about dragons. Something is mentioned about dragons. Is it the same thing that the traditions talk about? I don't know. You remember King Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon, that in his palace, to enter into the palace was this Ishtar gate right here, pictured right here. Here's a drawing of that. And had dragons. And here's a picture of a dragon. Shurish is the name of the dragon, but there was a picture of this dragon, and that was in the days of Nebuchadnezzar. In the days of Daniel. Daniel, it is thought, would have walked right through that gate to enter into the palace, perhaps. Well, Does that exist? Is that a real, how do we know that? Well, that has been discovered. This is in the museum in Berlin. There is something similar to that, I think, in Chicago at the Oriental Institute, but nonetheless, this is what they think not is a replica, but is the actual one that was discovered at Nebuchadnezzar's palace and pulled together and taken to Berlin. And so what do you have? You have these dragons. There was some kind of creature that they thought resembled that fits the dragon legends that we read about. All right, what have we seen so far? What's at issue with the dinosaurs? Why is it an important issue? And secondly, were they real? Yes. And did they exist? Yes. Now, third question is, did dinosaurs and man coexist? The evolutionist assumes, and when you talk to an evolutionist and they say, well, they couldn't exist, he's making an assumption. Ask him for his proof. Ask her for her proof. They're making an assumption they could not coexist. I want to suggest to you that man and enormously large creatures have and do coexist. The Komodo dragon, for example. That large lizard of 10 feet long, 275 pounds, can travel at 15 miles an hour, coexist with mankind. And so here we have a large creature. Well, we have more than that. The elephant's 11-ton creature, and yet he's controlled by man. You ever been to a circus and watched the elephants be controlled? Here's a man coexisting with an animal that can stomp him to death. And so consequently, man and enormously large animals. The blue whale, for example, that's some 200 tons in size, that's 400,000 pounds, has a heart the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, has a tongue large enough for 50 people to stand upon. That's a large creature. You say, well, he's in the sea, but still, we have this extremely large creature coexisting with mankind. To give you a comparison to a city bus and a gray whale, you see this picture of a 100-foot long, 100 and 150-ton blue whale. Here is an extremely large creature coexisting in our day and time with mankind. That's not a strange concept. Now let's talk about evidence of coexistence. Here is a discovery that was made a number of years ago. Now this on this one side right here is simply a picture of this dinosaur, the Dinosaurs. But notice on the right side of that is what's more interesting. And this is a petroglyph that was discovered by Samuel Hubbard in Arizona, in the canyon in Arizona, the Havasupai Canyon in Arizona. And notice the similarity in this drawing of this dinosaur and this upright drawing. And so what's the conclusion? Well, in the 1880s, in the late 1880s, Samuel Hubbard, he was the honorary curator of the archaeology at the Oakland, California Museum of Natural History, was excavating in this Indian dwelling in Arizona. And what did he find? Well, on the walls he found that the Indian ancestors, where the Indian ancestors once lived, he found the drawing of an elephant, a dinosaur, and other animals, and then he found this particular dinosaur that was standing upright. Here was the conclusion he drew. The fact that the prehistoric man made this pictograph of a dinosaur on the walls of the canyon upright completely upsets completely all of our theories regarding the antiquity of man. Now stop and think about that. So here's a discovery that just kind of turns upside down our preconceived ideas about man and coexisting with the dinosaurs. How so? So the fact that the animal is upright and balanced on its tail would seem to indicate that the prehistoric artist may have seen it alive. That perhaps they did exist hand in hand. And if we believe Genesis 1, we would believe that. Man has been around since the beginning of time. So if dinosaurs did exist, the evolutionists believe that. We believe that. If we're creationists, we believe that there is evidence dinosaurs did exist. Then the question comes, was man existing at the beginning, or did he come along long after the beginning, millions of years later? Well, let's go to our Bible and see. Let's go to Matthew chapter 19 and in verse 4. Here is a divine commentary on creation. You say, well, I read Genesis, and I'm not too convinced yet that was at the beginning, that may have been millions and millions and millions and millions of years later. Well, Jesus, the divine Son of God who was raised from the dead, said, have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female. And so I learned from that man has been around since the beginning. The same thing is quoted in Mark 10 and in verse 6, the parallel account. Romans 1 and verse 20 tells us essentially the same thing, and we see that again in Genesis chapter 1. Man was created on the sixth day. So if man was around at the very beginning, within 6 days of the creation, and those were literal 24-hour periods, Exodus 20, Exodus 31, if that be the case, then man did have to coexist with the dinosaur. Had to. Now how? Well, God made man in his own image. That became the basis for man having authority over the earth. You remember that? Let's go back to Genesis 1 just for a moment. God said, let us make man in our image and after our likeness. So man is being created in the image of God. And then notice at verse 28, then God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living creature that moves on the earth. There's some connection with God making man in his image and giving man authority over creation. Even though this is a huge, large animal that is humongous, he still had power and authority over that as he does the elephant, even in our own present day. Man has dominion over creation. We saw that in Genesis chapter 1 already. Psalm 8, we see the same principle. Verses 4 through 9, James 3, and in verse 7 say the same thing. Now, there are ancient dragon stories that suggest something along this line, as it were, did dinosaurs and humans exist together? And so again, we're quoting from Eric Lyons and Bert Thompson from Apologetics Press, that in the Far Eastern countries, such as China, dragons were often described in ancient writings. Some of them are said to have been domesticated and even pulled chariots of Chinese rulers. And many of the ancient Chinese people are said to have used dragon bones for special medicines and potions. While visiting the continent of Asia in the 1200s, Italian explorer Marco Polo said that he saw long reptiles called lindworms that easily ran as fast as a horse. In the British Isles, hundreds of dragon stories have come down to the present day. One account told of an animal that with a crested head, tooth like a saw, and a long tail. Also in 1449 in England, it was reported that two huge reptiles were seen fighting on the banks of the River Stour. And so you say, I won't remember that tomorrow. What you're going to see from that is simply the fact that there are traditions that are handed down that say that man and large animals, dragons for example, coexisted. Now finally, let's raise the question, what happened to them then? If dinosaurs existed a long time ago, they don't exist now. What happened to them? What happened to the dinosaurs? Well, the evolutionists offer several explanations of that. Now, keep in mind, they don't have to be consistent. Truth is consistent, but error can be inconsistent, and they are inconsistent. So one evolutionist says, here's what I think happened to them. Another one theorizes something else happened to them. Here's some of the explanations for that. That there was a sudden climate change so that they couldn't survive. Okay, we'll give them that. Some have argued that an asteroid, some 6 miles wide, I'm not sure how we know how wide it was, but a 6-mile wide asteroid impacted the Earth, causing dust and soot to block the sun rays, causing the plants to die, and in turn the herbivores and the carnivores, etc. And so then the dinosaurs were all wiped out because of this asteroid. We'll say more about that in a moment. Some think that maybe a massive disease wiped out all the dinosaurs, or some volcanic greenhouse caused the dinosaurs to pass on. Well, in response to this asteroid, I wonder, why did the asteroid kill every dinosaur but left other forms of life unharmed? We had this huge asteroid that hit the Earth and it blocked the sun rays, and so all the dinosaurs died off, but there are many other forms of life that were unharmed. That's interesting. And I want to have another question. Why did the asteroid not kill other reptiles like the turtles and alligators? Killed all the dinosaurs, but none of the other reptiles. And there's nothing in the fossil record, by the way, that supports the idea that all the dinosaurs died at once. Nothing that suggests that. Here's something we all agree to. That is, the evolutionists and the creationists all agree. Something catastrophic happened all of a sudden that accounts for the fossil record of the dinosaurs. So what is the creationist explanation of that? The flood. The flood. That's why we're studying the flood, or while we are studying the flood is what I meant to say. While we're studying the flood on Wednesday nights, that's why I want us to plug this thing of the dinosaurs in. So what happened to them? The creationist explanation for that is the flood. You see, let's go to Genesis 7 and in verse 19. We talked about this Wednesday night a little bit. Was this a localized flood? No, this was a universal flood. It covered the whole earth. We won't take the time to trace every reference. There are several. But notice in Genesis 7 and in verse 19 that the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills of the whole heavens were covered. Under the whole heavens were covered. So all the high hills were covered. This is a universal flood. And so consequently, a global flood explains the sudden death and the massive fossil graveyards that we find, whether it's in Colorado or be it in South Dakota or whether in China or wherever it may be. The evolutionist explains it as a seasonal or flash flooding. If there was a flood and you want to be a theistic evolutionist and harmonize your Bible with evolution, this was some kind of flash flood, and yet the Bible says that it was a universal flood. There's historical evidence of over 200 flood legends. And what do we mean by that? There are legends that have reported from the nations such as China and Babylon, Mexico, Egypt, Sudan, Syria, and on down the line. You can read all the rest of those that all talk about a flood legend. How so? Well, I'm quoting from James Piroff in his work called Tornado in a Junkyard. Interesting title. He said in 95% or more than 200 flood legends, the flood was worldwide. Now that's interesting. You take all the flood legends. Now we're not talking about the Bible itself, but legends about the flood that have been told all through the years in various countries. Over 200 of those. In 95% or more of those, the flood was worldwide. In 88%, a certain family was favored. In 70%, survival was by means of a boat. In 67%, animals were also saved. In 66%, the flood was due to the wickedness of man. Sound familiar? In 57%, they ended up on a mountain. In 35%, birds were sent out from the boat. And in 9%, exactly 8 people were spared. Sound familiar? Sounds a whole lot like what I read in Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9, doesn't it? There are flood legends all around the earth. Now, some of the dinosaurs may have been preserved in the ark. Some may have survived in the ark. That is, Noah was told to take 2 of every kind, not of every species, but of every kind. And so how could there have been dinosaurs on the ark? How was that possible if there were any dinosaurs to be preserved? Which ones? I don't know if there were. But how could that be? Well, the ark was huge. Remember from Wednesday night, if you were not here, just as a general reminder of what we've studied, it was 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet wide. It would hold the equivalent of 520 modern railroad boxcars. How many animals could you pack into 520 railroad boxcars? Would there be room for some dinosaurs? Not all dinosaurs were massive. I'm not going to take the time to read from Cal Butts, but basically he says that the idea that the dinosaurs were in the ark seems absurd. However, it's not so hard to accept the idea that they were on the ark considering, if you consider the subject carefully. And he mentions 3 things. First, he said God created all animals, and he knew exactly how big the ark needed to be. If God's the creator of the animal and of the ark, he knew exactly how big it needed to be. And secondly, the popular belief is that all dinosaurs were massive, and he said that's not the case. Some dinosaurs are not much larger than a large cow. And the third point, you see underlined there, he said God may have allowed Noah to take baby dinosaurs to the ark instead of full grown. And so he could take a newborn dinosaur perhaps and raise that on the ark for the year rather than take the large animal. There are a number of ways to explain the animal may have been on the ark. I want to close by noticing this information for what it may be worth. This is from Institute Creation Research. New studies find the dinosaur models are too thick. And so you can find this material online when we post our material online. I'm not going to read all of this, but basically what you're going to read here is that the museums, and particularly the evolutionists, have made the dinosaurs humongous and large. And more recent studies have suggested that the formula for determining the size of the animals is out of date. According to this research, today's dinosaurs, I'm reading the underlined section, modeled to depict dinosaurs being twice as massive as the new estimates say they should be. In other words, some studies are suggesting maybe the dinosaurs are not as big and as massive as we have said they were. They may have been that big. But some of the studies suggest, according to Brian Thomas, they may not be nearly that big. That may explain how some could have entered to the ark. Here's another explanation the creationists make. They died in the flood. Some of them went into the ark, and then some were driven to extinction. The climate change after the flood had to be obvious. You say, how so? Well, even people died at a younger age. We talked about that Wednesday night in our Bible study. That people died at younger ages after the flood. And so that may have explained part of what happened to the dinosaurs. The earth was filled with humans. And as it begins to be filled with humans, perhaps they hunted and killed, as happens with other animals. There are animals that in recent years, by recent years I'm talking about since the flood and since the close of the New Testament times, animals that existed that are extinct because they've been hunted by man and they have gone into extinction. And so that perhaps, or maybe eaten by some of the mammals. A number of things explain them. Here is from the AP report, Nature, dinosaur found inside a mammal. Villagers digging in China's rich fossil beds have uncovered and preserved remains of a tiny dinosaur in the belly of a mammal. A startling discovery for the scientists who've long believed early mammals couldn't possibly attack and eat a dinosaur. Sometimes our assumptions are incorrect. Well, that's a lot of material. That's a lot to cover. I wanted us to deal with that concept in connection with our study of Genesis and the flood account. What happened to the dinosaurs? Did man coexist? And the flood gives us a great deal of information and explanation for what happened to dinosaurs. So as your child gets fascinated with dinosaurs, that's great. Teach them the truth about dinosaurs. Get the right information. Don't ever tell your child or grandchild dinosaurs aren't real, they didn't exist. They did exist. But let's give them the truth with reference to dinosaurs. And ultimately, the matter of creation. There may be one or more present who's not a Christian, who's not a child of God. Would you come believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? Would you repent of your sins, acknowledge your faith, and be buried in the waters of baptism for the remission of sins? If you're subject in any way, would you come? All together we stand and while we sing.